clouds, singing wide to raise the new day.
Heard Strange Machines from the Gathering album Mandylion. This is the Record Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And we are going to be delving into a band that has been with us for a long, long time, even though it's probably not a band that we pay as much attention to in the last decade or so. And that's The Gathering from the Netherlands. And we are joined by a guest who we are crashing with as we speak. And even though you won't hear this episode until many moons after this event has happened, we are currently in Philadelphia at the Decibel Beer and Metal Festival, hanging out with our esteemed colleague and old school high school college friend, Chris Dick. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate the invite to attend the Gathering two-parter.
Ah, yes. And it's kind of funny. I was thinking about it. Chris has been with us for most of our, except for I think it's Fix, most of our major Dutch recordings. You did Pestilence with us up at the Godfather Mansion,
right.
And
legendary session.
Yeah, a legendary session. Yes, exactly. But for those of you that don't know or are new to the podcast, Chris's credentials is he. I'll let you list your kind of metal credentials and kind of how you fit into maybe Mark and I's universe for people that are new.
Sure, I'll start with the most recent stuff. I write for Decibel magazine. I've been writing for Decibel since 2006. It's now 2018, so it's a pretty long time.
It's a good tenure.
Yeah, good tenure, thanks to Albert. I also do like liner notes for record labels for certain projects like box sets. And
you've done, list off just a couple that you've done recently, because it's kind of a cool list.
Sure, yeah. Recently I was, Arch Enemy just put out a 13 LP box set, so I did the liner notes for that, working with Mike Amott. I did a In Flames box set that came out 2 years ago, working with
the 45
Anders.
LP version.
Yeah, it's insane. It's a huge box set.
It's 25 pounds.
Right, so I worked with Anders and Bjorn on that one. And then I just most recently did a liner notes for the reissue of Deeper Kind of Slumber by Tiamat. And then, so it was a pretty cool, I modeled after the Hall of Fame style interview where I interviewed all the band members except for Lars, the drummer, because he didn't want to be involved.
Gotcha.
But it was Johan, Thomas, the old guitar player, and Anders Ewers, who's the bassist. He's also the bassist for Dark and Cool.
Yep. Yeah, and you've done stuff for Asphyx and...
Yeah, I'm working on this Fix project now.
Yeah.
To do another sort of massive box set, working with Bob Backus, Martin Van Drunen, and Eric Daniels.
Cool.
So that'll be a huge project. And there's a Morgoth box set coming out as well that I worked with the band to do Morgoth. That's a little more low-key.
Yeah.
But nonetheless... coming out.
It's a lot of it kind of sounds like a good relationship with Century Media.
It is a pretty good relationship,
bit too. Yeah.
So I have a good relationship with the label over in Europe, and they're constantly asking, are you interested in this project or that? Like sometimes they have things that fall through, and I'm the sort of the cleanup crew, if you want to call it that. Devin Townsend, I did Deconstruction and Ghost, those 2 LPs for them when I guess something fell through on their end, and they needed something quick and they wanted something quality. So
yeah,
it was cool. It was cool.
It's a good reputation to have.
Yeah.
Quick quality. Yeah.
Yep.
And then Chris kind of goes all the way back to the origins of the name of the podcast with Mark with Requiem, which was a magazine you guys started.
Yep. So Mark and I started Requiem zine, as it were, in high school because we were bored, and I think that we were looking at other zines that we had bought to. We thought we could do better, and I think we did in some cases. In other cases, we didn't. But for the most part,
we had ambitious goals.
Yeah, right. And I think that
the poetry section's underrated.
It's probably the worst part of it.
I don't know, some of the early reviews that I did are some of the worst part.
I looked at some of my early reviews of Eclipse, and I was like, oh, gagging. Like, Jesus, what was I doing?
But at least you tried.
I got better. That's good news.
But I mean, Mark has an aesthetic, visually and sort of conceptually. I have an aesthetic to some degree as well, and we always wanted to do something that was a bit more official than a zine. So it was kind of like a zine with a bit of style or a bit of tradition, magazine publishing tradition, where we would actually take copies and saddle staple them instead of actually stapling them on the spine.
Yeah.
Across the front of it. So it kind of you had to like open these things up, and they would actually like rip pages out because they didn't know how to actually properly
do some of the stuff
paper
properly.
together.
Yeah.
So Mark and I were really focused on aesthetics and quality, as much as we could afford, right? A lot of these things were, we were making almost no money back then. So it took us a long time to kind of come up with the money to produce something that we thought would be to our standards, right? And then, of course, we tried to sort of project that standard from Requiem onto our interviews and our content, the artwork, and of course our communication with labels who eventually started to pay for advertising. So that was kind of the goal, really, was to see if we could make a living.
Ultimate validation to people actually pay us to do this.
Yeah, right.
And I think that aesthetic though carried over obviously with Eclipse, and then when Mark sort of joined with Eclipse magazine too. And I think that's like the philosophy that Mark and I sort of had with starting the podcast was, we've heard other people do sort of the mock radio metal head, kind of this song's awesome, and that kind of, I don't want to say a dumb version, but we'll use the word kind of dumbed down for like simpler terms, but do something that was a little more sophisticated and not necessarily like expensive, but very thoughtful and like in depth as much as we could do. And not every episode has reached that. Some we've done more kind of for fun or just like sort of off the cuff without a lot of research. Right. But it's that same kind of aesthetic approach, I think, to quality and treating something that we care about with a bit of intelligence and
respect,
reverence and stuff.
I mean, Requiem, is Latin for death song, so that was appropriate for us, especially in high school.
Looking through the thesaurus is like, God, that's the ultimate word.
Yeah. There were plenty of blood and guts zines and offensive word zines. If I don't know if we can swear on the podcast.
Oh yes, we can say whatever.
Eviscerated gut zine and whatever. Yeah. There were plenty of those out there at the time. We were just like, well, let's think of something a little bit more higher brow.
Sure.
But we weren't highbrow people, but something a little, like you said, treating the subject matter with a little more respect and
but I think
reverence.
putting that, even though we weren't all highbrow people, we all came out of Mount Pleasant High School, which is not a highbrow, college Ivy League sort of oriented high school or anything. But I think like having that aspiration as the goal sort of dragged us intellectually to push and move forward a lot. I think Mark and I talk about our film classes that we took and the amount of like world travel that you engage in and I engage in as well as much as I can, and it's just this I think metal sort of was a metaphor for that sort of drive to just do better and push beyond the comfortable what everybody else was doing or everybody else was watching or everybody else was listening to or I don't know. I think that's always been a driving force for a lot of like our group of friends, and that's probably why we've grown together, intellectually and sort of see the world maybe the same way, and stuff like that.
I think it's some of the people that we surrounded ourselves with at the time as well. Starting with maybe the people that were helping us like scan like imagery for the magazine at Kinko's or helping us get a better copy. going to the photo printer or the photocopier instead of the main copier.
Becoming friends with people so you could use you have to rent Macintosh by the hour.
Right.
And we're like, we can help clean up if we can use this.
Yeah. We'll vacuum Kinko's if we can.
We'll bring you a
the
pizza.
Macs.
Go for it, man. I don't care. Nobody's ever in here.
Right.
But I think too, like the record store too is a bonding agent for that too. Philosophically and getting pushed to explore music that was out of our comfort zones beyond even just metal.
Sure, and I think the record store is probably the pivotal point for all of us. Being sort of mentored by our manager Mike Johnston, but also him allowing us to kind of spread our wings under his guidance. So I think that was kind of a nice. And the people he had around him as well. So it's kind of this nice concentric circles that connected us to other people who may have not agreed with our taste in music, who may have thought it was childish, but they respected us for the interest we had in it.
They knew we were passionate
because they had their same interest in their music with the same level of respect and reverence and so forth. So there was a lot of sort of camaraderie, even if we didn't see eye to eye on the music styles, like whether it be jazz or rock or metal or whatever, or indie or electronic.
It was a microcosm for the world that everybody should really embrace more now.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Well, and I think like what you're talking about, this sort of concentric circles of influences and things like that, is sort of a perfect kind of metaphor for a band that is kind of difficult to tackle necessarily just in a complete metal context, which is The Gathering, you know. And sort of brings us back to to where we are with this band. We're going to organize it kind of into a two-parter is what we've sort of decided to do. And on the first part, we're going to kind of look at obviously the metal years for sure, and then kind of end with that sort of pivot point that they sort of go into where they start to embrace a lot more of the outside influences at a time, I think, that not just The Gathering, but I think you can see a pattern sort of happening. And Mark and I have always talked about, and I know I think I was living with you at this point when this phenomenon of I guess you call it the 1998, the 1999 phenomena of like, especially European metal, where it was like a lot of bands really turned and pivot pointed away from where their origin had been, the peaceful stuff that was sort of happening, a lot of change there. And I would put, bands like century media bands like The Gathering, and you mentioned A Deeper Kind of Slumber, and I think that's a really interesting companion piece to, especially, Mandylion and Nighttime Birds, that those kind of records fit together in terms of their perception of like, how to do a organic kind of gothic metal doom kind of composite or something, know.
But I think it all, a lot of this stuff kind of traces back, fortunately or unfortunately for Paradise Lost, to gothic.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe even like earlier than that, obviously the Celtic Frost, into the Pandemonium. Mm-hmm. But those sort of connecting lines between Pandemonium, gothic, and Wild Honey, and then maybe something like. I don't know, Eternity, or even Mandylion.
Silent Enigma, which we couldn't get a hold of, but I think was maybe a little more prominent in Europe,
But there's things that happened in Europe, especially the success of Wild Honey that really opened the doors for a lot of people to see that you just, you could do metal, but you could also be a little bit different.
I see a lot
heavy influence from Pink Floyd on that record.
Yeah.
And not only having like really like 4 songs on it, the rest were like instrumentals. So it was a really different record for the time, and the fact that it became Century Media's top seller for a long time, I don't remember the numbers yet, but it really started to pave the way for other people.
Yeah.
And Johan today doesn't even recognize it, right? He does, but he doesn't. Like Johan from Tiamat, he doesn't really acknowledge the fact that he paved the way for even like bands like him.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you listen to Skeletron, and you listen to Prey. Those are all things that are, even listen to some of the stuff that they were doing on Deeper Kind of Slumber.
Yeah.
Those are things that other bands like him or Billy Valla would pick up on and rewrite and redo and repolish into what they had to offer. So
I mean, I think you could maybe put I think Tiamat's out in front, but I think another band too would be maybe Amorphous. They were certainly a pivot point band for a lot of people.
Agreed,
and embracing a lot of outside influences.
Elegy for obviously the big one was Tales,
but Elegy was wasn't that Relapse's top seller for a long time?
It was,
yeah,
it was,
for a bit,
well,
So.
But it was that was also a pretty big record that could be traced back to bands trying to expand beyond their origins. And
then you leap from, I think, Elegy to the Opeth phenomenon, some of that stuff, for sure.
But I think with The Gathering, they're one of the more severe cases, I think, of moving from one thing to another, album to album.
Yeah.
Pretty abruptly.
Well, and let's kind of get into that because we don't want to spend too long on the sort of pre-Annika sort of years. But in terms of membership, the band members that we're sort of talking about here, you heard on Strange Machines, and I'll let you pronounce her last name, Annika
Van Giersbergen?
Van Giersbergen, yeah. Chris is a German minor, so we're going to leave him to the Dutch pronunciation.
Many years removed, so Dutch people, if you're listening, I apologize.
But I think the core of the band has always been the two brothers, Rene Rutten and Hans Rutten. And those, I've interviewed the Gathering a few times. I'm sure, Chris, you've had your encounters with them, and they always seem to be the two that I talk to. Mostly Hans, the drummer. He seems to be kind of the spokesperson, the Lars Ulrich of the band, if you will. At this point, too, going, I think, all the way back to Always, you had Jelmer Versma on guitar, Frank, Boyjan, is that how you pronounce it? On synth?
Good check.
Yeah. And then you had Hugo Prinsen Geerligs on bass.
Geerlings, yeah.
And Frank on synths will be with them through at least most of the stuff that we're going to be doing, as well as Renee and Hans. And then we'll, I believe Hugo drops out after Nighttime Birds, I believe. I wrote it down somewhere. I'd have to kind of look. But, the other guitar player leaves after Nighttime Burns, which we'll get into that. And that's kind of leads to, I think, a little bit more stripped down sound that we'll talk about and how to measure a planet. But when we go back to the early stuff, we'll come back to Strange Machines and put that in context a little bit. But that's kind of a great starting song. I think for us, it was the first song I ever heard, I think, from The Gathering on an identity comp from Century Media. It kicks off, Mandylion, which is kind of their big breakthrough record into the mainstream a little bit more. But when you go back to their first two, Always and Almost a Dance, I mean, this would be like your guys' era when you guys encountered Always and stuff like that. I mean, where did you guys sort of put that into context? Was it Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride immediately?
It was all that kind of doom boom that was happening at that point. I don't remember exactly when I heard. Do you remember when you first heard?
The Gathering was a tape. It was either
was
one of two
Pavement?
Scenarios.
It was Pavement Records? No?
It was actually one of two areas. One is we have a really good friend of ours, Dan Zadar, who I used to tape trade with, and he used to tape. I used to get weekly tapes from him of all these new stuff. I mean, he had connections all over the place, and I would just get all this stuff coming in, and me and Mark would, anytime I got a tape from Dan, I would call him up and say, I got this, and Mark would be like, cool. We'd find some time to listen to it, and then either we would freak out about it, or we'd be like, whatever. But The Gathering was one of those bands that was kind of taking the Paradise Lost thing, the gothic doom thing, and making it a bit more orchestral, I guess, if you want to call it that. But it still had the really gruff vocals, it still had the heavy guitars, but then it had like the keyboards that were a bit more
Calliope-ish
I
thing.
guess
I don't even know how to describe it, but
a bit more orchestrated, a bit more, instead of just being like chords being sort of repeated, it was actually like an instrument inside of the riffs and so forth.
Sure.
But I also remember Peaceful Volume 4 having a couple of things on there that were similar, like Traumatic Voyage. I was on there. They were, a German band that were trying to do similar things to The Gathering. So at that, there was Visceral Visceration, who were the Austrian
Celestial
band.
Season. I don't know
Celestial
when that
Season
debut comes out.
They were around at the time. They were
Crematory
Crematory from Germany were doing similar sort of gothic death metal. So this whole concept of gothic death metal was just starting to emerge out of the ashes of Paradise Lost and even Amorphous, even though they weren't really gothic. They just had that keyboard element that people were really starting to kind of key on.
Keyboards, before that, were kind of a dirty word.
It was all intros.
Intros, Morbid Angel stuff, or like even Celtic Frost
or something was okay. But after that, I was like, no, you don't want that.
I mean, to that point, I remember interviewing Mike from Opeth in 94, 95, and he was like, if we ever have keyboards in the band, it's time to quit.
Oh, wow. Here they are.
That's when they become successful.
Yeah, that's funny.
So, the mentality back then, and Mark, you guys are right, is that keyboards are really just an afterthought or an atmosphere generator. It wasn't really like an integral piece of the process or the music. And that's kind of what The Gathering, they changed that a lot, where they added keyboards. Amorphous was there too. As part of, it had a keyboard player, right? As opposed to just having,
I think Frank has always been like a huge part of the band in any era of The Gathering, the type of things. I think he'll become more integral as they get more experimental because he's able to sort of add different soundscapes. Here he's pretty traditional keyboard stuff, that you hear in metal.
Later you can add the percussive aspects of
sure,
it. Programming,
sure, the trip hop programming.
Well, also technology changes too over time. So, what they were dealing with in the early 90s, from a keyboard standpoint, is probably some of the same holdover technology from the late 80s that, the new wave and the post-punk and pop people were using.
Yeah.
So as I got into the 2000s, that's when technology started to get smaller, get better. You didn't have to lug a huge keyboard around. You could have a much smaller unit with more effects.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the Casio, market version where you had 6 different sounds and that's it.
So technology also influenced that as well, but I wouldn't say that's something we really want to delve into here for the gathering, because I'm not really sure how much technology Frank was using over time and how that changed his approach to keyboards. So,
but I think the other thing for people that maybe are only familiar with the Annika era and maybe don't know or aren't aware of it with Always is the presence of Bart Smits on vocals, and then you did have some female vocals from Marieke Groot. Hope I'm pronouncing that right, and she kind of had added layers, kind of like Paradise Lost, gothic, they're sort of, but I mean Bart's a traditional death doom vocalist, he's a growler, and so
he's a good one. He's got a lot of power. Me and Chris were talking about this yesterday, the Dutch formula of Jan Chris de Kooi, or what is that his name? De Kooi?
You say Jan Chris?
From Gorefest. They had that really a lot of enunciation and power behind the vocals.
Well, even Martin,
a Dutch thing.
From Asphyx and Pestilence.
Right. And I think that's something that the Dutch took from the British. Because the early British death metal bands, specifically Bolt Thrower, had really focused on diction. Really being able to understand what they were saying, even though it was really deep.
You could follow the lyric sheet.
You could follow the lyric sheet without being whatever.
No.
Only got into at that point where you had the mic cuppers.
Cupping Chris Barnes and Glenn Benton kind of stuff.
Well, Glenn Benton was paying basically on him too much time to cup the mic, but he was really close to the mic. Where you really start to kind of lose the wording
tonality
of what they were saying. And it became more rhythmic at that point.
Yep.
Instead of being actual a vocal with a diction attached to it.
Or Tardy, who just sang nonsense on the debut.
Yeah, I mean, he was kind of doing he was kind of like a death metal version of Elizabeth, whatever it is, Cocktail Twins, where she did Glossolalia.
Yeah.
So, which is funny because it's in a death metal context. And occasionally words would come out just like with Elizabeth Fraser.
Yeah.
She would say certain words and you think they're lyrics, but it's not.
That's how Sigur Rós as well. There's no actual...
Yeah, people thought it was Icelandic, but it was just sort of their own weird, bizarre language. Yeah. So, I mean, where, was Always a big record in any sort of capacity in 1992 when it came out? Or was it just sort of part of this sort of general European metal atmosphere that was kind of going on? I guess I don't know how big of a shock it was. Was there a huge groundswell of Gathering fans that were about to be shocked by what they were going to do next? Or
well, from the European side, I'm not really entirely sure. But from the States side, I mean, I think that it was something new because the Gathering had a much brighter sound than, say, Paradise Lost or
major
Morphus.
chords and stuff were being used.
Exactly. I don't know if it was big per se. I don't think anything back then was terribly big.
It was big, yeah.
But I think that there was it set the stage for something. It was setting the stage for something else, even if they didn't know it at the time.
Sure. And then you get to Almost a Dance, which is the second record, and it's... I mean, I wonder just, do you know why Bart left? Or did they kick him out? Or was he just done with the scene? Or did they want to move in a different direction? I have no idea. I just didn't know if you guys knew back in the day, if you heard rumblings.
I'm sure we probably read about it in some zine or something like that.
Yeah.
That we had ordered. As far as Bart leaving, information back then traveled very slowly.
Sure.
So by the time he left, they were probably already done with Almost a Dance, right? By the time we knew that he had left, which was then a shock because we're like, oh well. That's fine. Vocalists leave, and they'll get a new one, and he'll growl just like the other guy.
And then you get Neil's.
But Neil's Duff Hughes.
Duff Hughes,
obviously, and I got that for sure. Tape traded by Dan, because he was he wrote me a letter saying, Almost a Dance is different from
different. Different. Nothing wrong with that.
From Always,
and
I was like, okay, well, different's not bad, but and then I pushed play, and it was like, what happened?
Yeah.
It had the same shock when Mark and I were really into Soulside Journey by Darkthrone. And the first time we heard, I think it was on Peaceful Volume 4, A Blaze of Northern Sky, and we're like, this is not even the same band.
Yeah.
It's like
Jaw on the floor, but then it quickly kind of like that was interesting.
Yeah.
Whereas Almost a Dance is kind of a colossal,
like
not a failure, because musically I think it's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it's the same kind of stuff that they were doing. I think with Always, it's just you weren't expecting like a Mike Patton, Faith No More kind of thing. And
sure, I mean, I think in general you just didn't expect the guy to be singing at that point.
Yeah.
Over the top of what heavy-ish orchestrated music.
It seemed like a letdown at the time because like that was death metal. That was the thing, is the vocals that really set it apart. And then you got this guy, I guess, singing, and it was just.
And I think the Almost a Dance, it was immediately like the minute they heard that there was a guy singing on it, people were like, "I'm not interested."
Yeah, it seemed like it just was like one of those weird records that just sort of disappeared almost, from history.
I mean, I think even on the States side, there was no licensing for it in the States. Never got licensed in the States, in fact. So.
I still don't own a copy of it. You don't need. I mean, that's like I don't know anyone that has that record or talks about it.
Well, imports were expensive back then. So
Dan Zadar's got a copy.
Yeah, I'm sure Dan probably does.
But imports were expensive back then. They're $20, right? So you're either going to spend $20 on something you like, or something that you want to fill your catalog.
Yep.
And I don't care. At that point, I was like, the gathering's done for me.
Yeah,
right,
for sure. You still had some female vocals. You had.
I had the dub cassette. That's enough for me, right?
Yeah.
I can spend $20 on Ophthalmia instead, or something like that.
Much better purchase. But it's interesting that like for some they still hung on. They had Martine Van Loon, this female vocalist that kind of did some stuff on it, and she'll go on to join Orphanage,
who were great.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember.
Very groovy, very Dutch.
Weren't they in Displeased?
They were in Displeased.
Yeah, I kind of remember them a little bit.
Yep. I still have those two
So
records.
it's still like in there, this formula, but they're still trying to figure out what that formula is. And then, of course, how surprised were you in '95 when they signed a big label for you guys, big label, Century Media. I think by '95 was one of the labels that was an elite underground metal label.
Nuclear Blast and them.
And I mean, when you heard it? What was your initial impression of Annika? I guess.
I was immediately into it because I think that by that point, females in metal were just starting to become common.
Like Serenades was a big thing with like our group of friends too, so I think that kind of helped bridge.
Third in the Mortal, I think Third in the Mortal, right?
Yeah. Third in the Mortal, who were just emerging at that time. I think
Tears Laid was '94. I think it was the year before.
Was it '94? Because the EP was for sure '94.
Okay.
But there were a lot of things that were happening in the scene that allowed for women to be front people, I guess, or persons, in a way that was accepted. And because there was a lot of quality in general, I mean, you could tell immediately who was trained and who was not, even though Annika's not really trained per se.
Like a Carrie Ruslotten or something
exactly,
like that.
Something like that. I mean, there's a select few. I mean, traditionally female vocalists in metal were growlers. I mean, even across the sun, who are Dutch, had a female growler, right? So that was kind of like predates the whole Angela Gossow thing for Arch Enemy.
Or Karen Crisis.
Or Mythic, right? Mythic is a perfect example. Or Duquetta.
Karen Crisis.
Karen
for whatever,
Crisis, I'll give her
regardless of what you want to
absolutely. Yeah. So, anyway, going back to the story. It was a shock, but it was a good shock. Because, the difference between Mandylion and Almost a Dance is songwriting. And I think on Almost a Dance, it's almost something they were forced to write that record. Just to fulfill a contract. It's really unfocused. It's kind of feels a bit segmented.
Schizophrenic.
It's an experiment kind of gone wrong.
Mandylion is one of these records that is, with Annika fronting and the songs that are there felt cohesive, and it felt like, okay, here's something, right? And here's something new.
Well, and even stuff like In Motion number 1 and In Motion number 2, there's like almost, musically thematic elements happening.
Sure.
Sort of. There's a general sort of feeling that I'd kind of describe. Strange Machines, which we heard before, it's got that great H.G. Wells Time Machine sample. And I've always, maybe Mark will understand this reference point, but when I listen to this, and then when I saw a movie like Hugo that Scorsese did, which is sort of about the early Lumiere, the French cinema, like Trip to the Moon, and some of the weird experimental stuff. Who's not Lumiere? Who's the guy that did Trip to the Moon? The first special effects guy. from France. We study him in film class.
Yeah. You guys are the film buffs.
Yeah, but like that movie has this like childlike kind of quality to it. It's really a children's film that Martin Scorsese did, and it's got this sort of fantastical train station sequences and things. And I guess the time machine aspect of the samples and some of the general feeling, I associate this with that same feeling that I get when I listen to this, that when I watch Hugo.
Right.
I don't know why that makes sense to me, but it's something like it's got like a childlike innocence to like Annika's vocals.
Yes.
There's nothing threatening about anything that the Gathering is doing.
Metal at all, right?
Yeah, but yet it has these heavy riffs. It's got like this doom undertone, and there's even some darker George Millet. Yeah, that's what it was. Méliès. Yeah.
You're French people, sorry.
Yeah, we're
Americans.
We're Americans.
Yeah. We don't care about accents.
And by the way, the J in Dutch is pronounced a Y.
Is it? Okay. See, I knew Chris would get us in a pinch. Yeah. But I think also there's like a quality of like Dead Can Dance on this too. You know, like some of the instrumentation.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, I think the Gathering with Mandylion was there's a sort of a childlike naivete, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
There's also this sense of exploring,
wonder.
Yeah, exactly, 100% wonder. That's really what that. I think that's probably the key word.
Non-ironic wonder.
Yeah, that's probably the key word I would.
And that's why like this children's like quality. Like when you see Hugo, it's like, oh, Scorsese's doing a children's film. This is gonna be like fucked up, but yet it is really pure. There's something really organic about it. That's honest.
From the right place.
You know?
So I think there's probably a couple key words. Wonder is one of them for this record. Purity is another one for this record. And maybe exploration or being intrepid and not wanting to wanting to blaze a trail even if you don't even know if you're going to succeed.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's kind of what they did on this record. And at the time, metal was just starting to become more experimental, more open to other things, coming into it, especially death metal.
Yeah. Death and doom metal, I think, were really kind of opening those doorways.
When you look at any of the ads that the Gathering were, they were always sandwiched next to, a death metal band or something like that. They were being marketed towards us, even though it was technically not even in our traditional music sphere.
Not at all, really. Outside of distortion of the guitars.
Right, exactly.
But I think Tiamat Wild Honey was the same way too, right? That was kind of that's how it was marketed to me. It was like, if you like Pink Floyd and death metal, yeah, that's true. You still have the death vocals, but
or gruff at least.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was a special record for a time because it kind of showed that not only were one band from the Netherlands willing to experiment, you had other bands like Amorphous, like Tiamat. Moonspell were just starting to kind of get away from.
I put them in the same boat.
Black metal era.
This is also the era of Bjork and Tori Amos too. So there was like a crossover with all that stuff as well.
And Radiohead were just emerging at that point. I think we're talking.
The 95. Benz is 95.
Yeah. So you're talking about different cultural things happening in the music industry.
The trip hop scene is just bubbling in Bristol with Massive Attack and Portishead Dummy. I think was 94. Yeah, 94. Yeah. So I mean that's floating around the surface.
So there's things that are happening.
Prodigy, some of the electronica stuff that's sort of starting to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're seeing all this stuff happen outside of the world that was just kind of creeping in, slowly but surely.
Yeah.
And of course everyone likes Pink Floyd, but no one really wanted to incorporate a David Gilmour guitar solo into
could they
into a Terrorizer song.
Right?
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But now that we're slowing down and becoming more prosaic or more atmospheric in the approach, suddenly a David Gilmour style guitar solo made sense.
Yeah.
Right, and it was fitting. In fact, bands did that.
I mean, I think Anathema were really out in front of that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The singer-songwriter thing was with even Tim Buckley or Jeff Buckley. Was kind of becoming interesting to musicians who were growing up.
Yeah. I mean, I think people like Jonas were discovering not just Buckley, but maybe rediscovering, some of the lost, forgotten, like suicide folk, like you mentioned Tim Buckley, Nick Drake.
I think singer-songwriter at that point, too, was like a novel thing that was coming back into the culture.
I mean, Buckley wasn't really super appreciated until kind of posthumously, after he died, recording the follow-up to Grace. But
yeah, so there's a lot of things happening, and a lot of bands were starting to become more vocal in what their influences were.
Yeah.
Catatonic were always very vocal about their outside influences and as their primary influences. So
Paradise Lost talked about Sisters of Mercy
New Model
Fields of Niflheim and things like that. Yeah.
And even like bands like Bronski Beat. So I think that with Gathering, going back to Gathering, not getting too caught up in the other stuff, is that they were also part of that generation of wanting to explore.
Well, I listened to an interview this morning with Hans, and they were kind of talking about like why did they sort of start bubbling with metal. He said the town that they grew up in, which is, I think it was a kind of a smaller town, was very much like everybody was into metal.
Yeah.
And he said like if I had grown up in a town that there might have been more like indie rock kind of stuff, we might have made it the same journey, but we would have come maybe more out of like an indie rock sort of place. I mean, I don't know if that's like sort of retroactive history on his part, distancing themselves from metal. It's you don't know.
But I think he's doing that. I think he's just explaining to you
that they were just all metalheads. Yeah.
His music output would have been different.
Well, look at Mount Pleasant where we came from. Like people that grew up in that community, like were listening to European metal on a probably higher percentage than almost any other comparable community like Mount Pleasant in the United States.
Easily. Well, yeah. I mean, I think there are other satellite things. I mean, if we look at like where Albert grew up, in northern PA,
but that's still near Philadelphia. That's at least satellite-y.
It's no different from us to Detroit.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Insofar as being remote, especially at the time.
Yeah.
He grew up in that.
There was a little bubble there. So there are these couple bubbles.
So there's bubbles all over the country,
where people were being exposed to and interested in, extreme music, and they were, doing something, whatever they could, in order to spread, get their friends into it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we did.
Sure.
I think Mark still can't listen to Sleeping Beauty by Tiamat.
Well, I'm over it now. That's good. You said.
Yeah, a lot of people have heard that song a lot. I remember we talked about that in the Tiamat song. So, but let's get back into the music a little bit. We've kind of introduced, I think, these 3 records that we're going to sort of pursue here. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about Eleanor and In Motion #1 when we sort of come back, which are the 2 songs from Mandylion that we're going to hear here. But we've got Stonegarden from Always, which is the debut, and then the sort of notorious or infamous Almost a Dance. We're playing a song called The Sky People, and then we have Eleanor and In Motion #1 from Mandylion.
Oh
That was Eleanor, the Sky People, and Stonegarden from The Gathering. And we sort of made a call after that. So if you were like wondering where In Motion #1 was, it disappeared from the ether into nothingness. Because we sort of got sidetracked in that first talk set, and for time's sake, we kind of have to keep it, within a certain limit so that Mark doesn't have to up the quality or lower the quality of the songs and stuff
or
like
bust
that.
a two-parter or a one-parter
into like a 1.5, all that sort of stuff. And plus, we had already played Strange Machines, so we knew we kind of already had given you enough, I think, of the texture of Mandylion there. But Eleanor...
You can always go to the internet to listen to it.
Yeah, In Motion #1 is a fantastic song. Leaves is another big single, and that was actually... They did a video for that one as well. But Eleanor, I think the one thing I want to say about that song that we didn't really say in the first set, we talked a lot more about Strange Machines kind of coming out with this iconic riff and the sampling of Time Machine and different things. But Eleanor... the push into the refrain is really, really awesome. There's a kind of an immediacy to it. I kind of compare it to something like Bride would have done on Angel in the Dark River. It kind of has some of that same, like, especially how they use some of the electronica synths to really like sort of drive into that darker kind of like heavier moment in Eleanor. I thought was really pretty interesting. So, but we've sort of introduced The Gathering a lot in that first set, and now we kind of start to pivot a little bit with Nighttime Birds, which is... both these records were my first introduction to The Gathering in a big way. When I first met Chris, we've talked a lot about Wild Honey in the last talk set a little bit and the influence that record had. I had read about, do you remember the magazine Livewire?
Yeah.
Okay. I was reading Livewire in addition to my hit Paraders that I had back in the early 90s. And they did a short one-pager on Tiamat Wild Honey. And the tagline was, if you like, it'd be like if... Pink Floyd did a death metal record. I was a Pink Floyd guy, and I was starting to ease my way, especially into American death metal. Right. So I went to the record store, New Moon. Chris was working there, and I ordered Tiamat Wild Honey, and he kind of did a record scratch, like, what? Like, why? How do you... I remember you go, how do you know about this? Yeah,
right.
And you ended up giving me some samplers. I think a Relapse, the UHF sampler from Relapse, and some other things. And pretty quickly after that, you got me the Identity comp, which had a Gathering song on it from Mandylion, and I was hooked. I was like, "Oh, this is something I can play around my girlfriend." I can play. There's a heavy song, but I can kind of like play it around girls, and so it fit all that sort of stuff. Well, Nighttime Birds was on top of that was a big, very personal record. I was telling these guys yesterday, it really takes me back to like the end of high school, and just sitting in my girlfriend at the time's room and just enveloping in that atmosphere, because it was one of those records you could put on around other people and it didn't scare them or bother them in any sort of way.
Right.
But I think what was interesting about it is you really start to hear them embracing on this record, like the Joy Division, The Cure, especially 17 Seconds, that record, Psychedelic Furs, the May song itself really has like a kind of a Psychedelic Furs kind of feel to it. And, they're starting to expand a little bit, but I still think Nighttime Birds, which is the record we're going to get into next, is kind of a refinement of Mandylion a little bit. It's not that much more experimental. It's not really taking them too far away from that sound there. It has more diverse sort of soundscapes, I think. It's got shorter songs like May Song and Kevin's Telescope that are a little bit more digestible. Not everything has to be 6.5, 7 minutes long, It's just deeper, some of the layering and things like that. It's a little dreamier, I think.
The vocal performance is better, too.
Yeah, I think Annika has a little bit
more.
Yep, a little bit more sort of confidence to it, Songs like On Most Surfaces, which is what we'll be playing this next set, just has this real, like, bombacity to it. I mean, she really feels assured enough to really just sort of soar over things, which she did on Strange Machines, but I think this is like a, more of that in a way.
Right.
I think there's some happier elements too. Like we're going to play Third Chance, and I think that's more of like almost an upbeat sort of song, which was different from the doom death stuff that you heard in earlier era.
Oh, sure.
But what are your thoughts on this record? Because we were definitely hanging out a lot when this record came out.
I mean, I think I think you said a couple of things. One is Annika became more assured in her performance and her voice, or voice than performance. That's one major thing. The other major thing is the gothic element became less pronounced, even if it wasn't really that pronounced on Mandylion. I think they became more almost alt rock or indie rock in a way that separated them from even Mandylion. Right, Mandylion was kind of still plying in the gothic metal trade a lot, just because of I'm sure the Gathering were probably not wanting to be too different from what they've done before. But I think this record is, again, like you said, it was a pivot away from that into being something that's very much their own thing.
Do you see this in the same context as like Deeper Kind of Slumber, which was released the same year, 97? Or do you think that was more rooted definitely in gothic kind of stuff, whereas this is kind of separating itself more?
I think this is a more logical progression than Tiamat did it with a Deeper Kind of Slumber.
I would agree with that.
This one seems like like Mark was saying, it's a continuation of previous themes with a more refined aspect to it. Whereas Deeper Kind of Slumber is just yet another one of Johann's visions, probably post mushroom,
post cocaine roller skating trip.
Ventures into dreamland. He always talks about dreamland and dreams, and I think that was his record to be that, right? And I think that it's so much different from what they were doing, which is more song oriented. Whereas instead of soundscape oriented.
Well, and I think it should go without saying, and this is, I think, really, really important, because I think the Gathering is almost, they sort of have like guilt by association in the same way that like maybe Helmet or Rage Against the Machine or Deftones have in terms of like their association with some of the not so fine points of like new metal and that rap metal sort of sound, is that there's something different about the Gathering, even from like the get-go, that's going to really separate them from the Lacuna Coils, the Night Wishes, the Theater of Tragedies. I kind of wrote, there's something about them that you can kind of just tell that the Gathering weren't going to be like a Hot Topic kind of band, or that they're not going to wear like pleather and puffy shirts and some of that kind of stuff.
They're a rock band.
Yeah,
really.
They seem like they're interested in like rock and roll and hard rock and
like
indie
Annika
rock
has a positive image too, which is not a common thing.
True, she's not depressive and
she's
emo-y.
smiling. You can almost like just listening to her, like especially in like the song "Nighttime Birds," you can almost see or hear that she's smiling while she's singing it.
Yeah,
and she has like this positivity that it was like
Third Chance, especially
weird,
really
but
upbeat kind of song.
It works, yeah.
And they also, I think, one thing too, and it's probably more of a minor point, is they didn't glorify her as a sex object.
Exactly.
She was just.
Yeah, they're not putting in tight leather the way that Christina.
Her boobs weren't showing and all that stuff. Her breasts weren't exposed, I guess.
Yeah.
She was more just like an indie chick.
She seemed feminine,
right?
But like not in a cool way. Like there was something like powerful and positive about her
like
femininity.
Ani DeFranco vibe to how she looked earlier on and stuff like that too. So it's like an empowerment thing.
Yeah.
She fit in with. I think you mentioned this last thing. I think she fit in with like that Tori Amos sort of thing, like female empowerment, but not like ownership of your sound, but not like debasing yourself to sell records.
Yeah, there wasn't an aggro aspect to it either.
Ownership of your sexuality,
sweet and pure, like a child or like childlike, where she's trying to be.
Even now, when you see interviews with her, just big smile, bubbly, but intelligent too. It's not like she's like naive about this stuff.
There's a joy for life,
which
is contrary to the death metal thing that we're always always interested in.
Yeah.
Which is, the darkness and the oppressiveness and the opaqueness of it. This is really bright and clear and positive.
Yeah.
Well, I think
positivity is one of the weirdest things to ever put into any of these podcasts. But
it is.
For being a positive factor on the music too. Usually it's not a good thing.
Well, in addition to like embracing some of the kind of like 80s kind of influence, like I mentioned, the Joy Division, The Cure, this is a point, 97 when Nighttime Birds comes out is kind of a pretty pivotal year for, I think, the sort of last part of the 90s and early 2000s in terms of like indie rock and alternative music. You have Portishead self-titled coming out, which was a huge record where they really embrace a lot of like James Bond kind of trip-hoppy sort of stuff. And then OK Computer, which, I mean, OK Computer and then even DJ Shadow Introducing, which came out in 96, that had a huge influence, I think, on OK Computer. Even Radiohead talks about that. Those are records that like a lot of metalheads were listening to, and just people that were in general who were like expanding their stuff.
There were select metalheads listening to DJ Shadow.
Well, not DJ Shadow so much, but I think OK Computer was like one of these weird crossover records, whereas like the Bends came out and was sort of quiet. OK Computer blew up, and I mean like a lot of people were talking about that record, and that record bled into a lot of different influences. I mean, even like Dillinger Escape Plan kind of talking about what that record meant to them, and so everybody heard that record in kind of a weird context. And even though it's not going to show up here, where we're going to go kind of to end the show in this next set after we play Third Chance and On Most Surfaces is we're going to sort of venture into, I think, their really pivotal record. I think it's the record that almost like sets up like phase 2 of The Gathering. If Always is their introduction, I think phase 2 of The Gathering begins in 1999 with How to Measure a Planet, this double record. Right. That and this is at a point where my work with Eclipse was starting to increase by I think issue 3 and issue 4. I kind of became an editor and started actually doing not just doing reviews but actually interviewing bands. And I happened to interview The Gathering on this record. And I remember talking to Hans, and he was saying that the whole thing was a kind of a Pink Floyd LSD journey, and he had taken a lot of LSD when he started to conceive of like how this record was going to sort of fit together in this weird. I don't want to say it is a concept record because it's not a concept record in the way that like Operation Mindcrime or even The Wall or things like that are. I think it's very much a loose kind of like, but the loose thematic kind of concept that they're doing here. But they bring in a new producer, and you had talked about, I don't think we actually talked on mic, but the guy that they had worked with once they joined Century Media was Valdemir Sorshada, and then the in-house Century Media guy that you were talking about. Yeah. And, that was kind of the guy that worked and did a lot of the stuff, kind of like Scott Burns did for Roadrunner. And
he was Century Media's in-house guy.
Yeah.
Right at the Woodhouse Studios in Hagen, Germany.
Yep. And they bring in another guy by the name of Addy Bao, who had worked with, he had done Painkiller, he had done those Fight records, he had done Scorpions' Crazy World. And again, not the guy that I would sort of say just based on those records that would help like a band achieve like their sort of psychedelic, loose, experimental phase. Right. But for whatever reason, maybe it's just a new set of eyes and a new set of ears in the studio that kind of helps them really, sort of move in that direction. And I've always said, like in rock history, and I talk about this in my rock and roll class, that when, there is this sort of atom bomb of OK Computer that sort of floats through a lot of different genres, and to me this is an album that has some of that OK Computer effect, whether it was subconscious on their part or not. I know that they were fans of Portishead, they were fans of Massive Attack, they were fans of Radiohead, as were a lot of like rock bands. I think
the OK Computer thing just showed like you don't have to just be this, you can be this,
you can be way this. And I think this is The Gathering starting to really push those boundaries in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a song, the title track itself that ends things is like a 22-minute long instrumental or something like that. I mean, that's it's a double disc. It's still on Century Media, but it's not a metal record by any means. I mean, there's a song we're going to play called Probably Built in the 50s, which has probably the most metallic kind of element of the whole record. But, Annika's starting to write her own songs. She writes Locked Away and My Electricity, which is a really beautiful ballad. You're getting these almost indie rock kind of elements happening. Right. Liberty Bell, which was kind of the big single. Yeah. There was a video for it. We'll get into that to sort of end the show. But, you had a lot of electronica sort of thing happening. This is at an age when I think MTV is starting to play a lot of, Prodigy and Fatboy Slim. And, that kind of movement is sort of happening. Yep. So they're sort of right in it, and I think they're very much in like a Euro kind of thing too. MTV Europe. I think when I lived in Italy in late '99, early 2000, there was a lot of like electronic, like pop indie alternative music. That was like this weird mergence.
Yeah, I mean that right around this era too. If that all came in with My Dying Bride and with Paradise Lost. And
you saw an Anathema and especially Paradise Lost. With Host and 1 Second and things like that. Yeah. Marooned, which is a song we're going to hear after On Most Surfaces, you've got this sort of bubbling, kind of incessant sort of like drum loops and electronic loops happening. There's a theremin there. There's more like emotional, sort of introverted, sort of like vocals. The themes are way further away from kind of, like you said, gothic or metallic kind of elements, and they're getting
the tenets of the genre from where they came from are no longer
just
visible.
Gone. Yeah, I mean, there's really almost like no ties to it. Yeah, it's on Century Media, and metal fans like ourselves. I don't know if everyone was getting into it, but do you remember the sort of how this album was received? I mean, I was sort of writing at that point too, but I don't know if you kind of got like a general vibe. Well, I think people were shocked by it, or
I don't think the shocking. I think one thing it was too long. I think the double disc of this sort of experimental indie stuff to most metalheads was a bit much.
Required a lot of patience on the part of a listener to sit down with headphones and kind of sort out some of what was happening.
The sort of the innocence or the naivety of Mandylion Nightime Birds was also gone.
Mm-hmm.
This is a much more assured record, and instead of being childlike, it's more like a teenage record where there's a lot of angst and a lot of
ponderous.
Yeah, exactly. Like trying to find out, okay, here we are. Now it's what? This is 97?
This is 99.
99?
98, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
98,
Yeah, right, 98. So if you separate Always from this, we're talking 92, 91 to 1998. So, generally considered it's not that long a time. But for the Gathering, and what they did over that trajectory of time is pretty significant.
Mm-hmm. And for most death metal bands, actually.
Right.
Yeah. Paradise Lost, Anathema. I mean, even go back to the Beatles. You look at the Beatles in a 6-year time span, you're going from Hard Day's Night to Sgt. Pepper's and beyond.
Right.
Exactly. Cathedral. I mean, Napalm, all these bands are completely...
Cathedral as well. Yep.
So, but I mean, with the Gathering, I think that this is the record where they kind of disconnected from the cute kind of gothic thing that they were sort of flirting with on Mandylion Nighttime Birds into something a bit more. This is an indie rock thing. This is we're not going to be singing about sad things and stuff
but if they are, it's going to be more intelligently sad or like more of a
this to me seems more of a modern observation.
Yeah, for sure.
Of the time, because we're approaching the millennium. People are thinking about the millennium. People are thinking about like what is contemporary, because at that point the past was not really cool.
Yeah,
like even if you think about death metal, like a band like Asphyx, for example, knew they weren't cool, but they did it anyway, right? Other bands knew they weren't going to be cool. They had to move on in order to be relevant, and they did things to do that. Now, that made them sound dated in some cases, also quite contemporary in others.
This is kind of the first era where that really became a thing, where you had to feel relevant. Like an established act had to feel... And I don't think that's really a thing anymore. Like, Judas Priest now, they thrive because they sound like Judas Priest, not because they're trying to sound like...
When you look at what Halford did, like with Fight and things like that, and
Voyeur and all that weird shit.
So I think that's kind of what this How to Measure a Planet is like. I think it's their observation record. It's their.
I think it's their light record too. I think
I look relevant.
I look at this stuff
in really fast changing times.
Yeah, and I also look at I think it's almost like consciously or subconsciously very much the quietest record that they did, because even If Then Else and Souvenirs, which we'll talk about in part 2, maybe Home would be the other exception. I think this and Home are the two very quietest, most subtle records they did. There's really only Liberty Bell has some kind of catchy, sort of very in your face kind of riffs, but it's upbeat and happy and things like that. And then probably Built in the 50s, which we can talk about when we come back here. I mean, there's a monster shoegaze Neurosis riff after, but it's about 4.5 minutes into the song where it finally starts to cohese. But there's a lot of, it's almost, like I said, purposely Pink Floydish, purposely sort of, indie rockish. And I think we'll talk about this more in part 2, but I think they come back after How to Measure a Planet and sort of say, all right, we've laid all these different influences out. How can we actually combine stuff more cohesively?
Sure. But I think with this record too, I mean, there's if you look at the cover is just like a bunch of Photoshop gears and other stuff.
Time travel, I think, is a big part of. I don't know if it's a rocket. I believe it probably is kind of a rocket engine. Crap,
photoshopped onto it. The yellow is also something that was very unmetal.
Yeah.
So again, I think they were really trying to disconnect from what would be perceived at the time as a past that was kind of not cool.
Yeah.
Because this was kind of the age of cool for music in some degree, where, if you talk about the hip things like Massive Attack and Portishead, Radiohead, a lot
on
of
the
British
cusp
stuff.
of internet.
Yep, the internet was just now starting to kind of, especially the university level, was starting to become more accessible to students, and there's a lot of different information sharing going back and forth. So I think that's kind of what they did here, is they tried to separate from the past. And other bands did the same thing. Dark Tranquillity did the same thing on Projector.
Yeah.
Right? Moonspell was doing the same thing on the Butterfly Effect. And
Sin Pecado.
Sin Pecado before, but Butterfly Effect more particularly, I think that was 98.
Yeah. 99, 98. Yep.
But most of these bands at that point that have been around for 5 years, they're like, well, where can we? The trajectory was just like up and up and up. There was no like ceiling on it.
It sort of also seemed like the traditional sort of death doom metal sort of seemed like a dead end for a lot of people. Like, well, we need to recreate ourselves because that's the only way sort of to get out. Yeah. And then they almost recollect, like I was kind of saying, The Gathering will do. Like, okay, let's grab all the shrapnel and like in the early 2000s, maybe we can actually get a little heavier and still be a little bit indie rockish.
Because early death metal is a completely radical idea, and then when you keep staying with it, it becomes a conservative idea. Like you have to keep,
it becomes kind of derivative and stuff like that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I think this is a real interesting era. If you were like ourselves, and I can't speak for Mark because I think Mark, you probably were less interested.
I kind of checked out at this point.
Yeah. And we'll talk in part 2, kind of if you ever kind of flood it back in. But I know for sure,
an alt site I liked a lot.
Yeah, Chris and I were definitely like into watching the trajectory of a band like this. Probably in the same way you were very much into watching what Paradise Lost was up to. Like I'm on board for this journey, whatever the heck it's going to be.
Believe in nothing.
Yeah, I still like that record.
Yeah, hey, there's good songs. We talked about it in our podcast.
I'm the only one out of anybody that Decibel could even talk to that could write a quote for it to say anything positive. So
well,
maybe I'm just an apologist.
Something Real is the great song. Everything else, not so much.
I think there's like another song I like on there. I can't remember. I don't hate that record.
I enjoy the record.
I have it, but yeah.
So let's do it. Let's get kind of into this a little bit, and we've got a pair of songs from Nighttime Birds, which we kind of talked about, the more upbeat Third Chance, and then the album opener, which probably is the heaviest riff on Nighttime Birds, which is On Most Surfaces. Which just great song that I kind of remember playing this song. I kind of forgot to tell this quick story. I did a paper in college on the art of mixtapes. And my teacher loved it so much that she made me make her a mixtape. There's an English, I think, it was my English 101. Because
she made you take her on a date, too. Right?
Yeah.
That's a new story.
Yeah, no, that didn't happen. And she was cool. She used to talk about X-Files and stuff like that all the time. But anyways, she wanted me to do a presentation to the class on the art of mixtape and play some of this weird stuff that I was into. And I remember playing On Most Surfaces to like my CMU class and just kind of being like, this is really awkward. And I don't know if they give a shit about this, but like I'm being made to do this.
Nodding and smiling for 7
cool,
minutes.
Cool. Yeah, it's a bunch of college kids that just want to get the fuck out of there and do whatever they want to do. And I'm just playing them, a Dutch kind of quasi metal band with female vocals, but and then a pair of tunes from How to Measure a Planet. We have Marooned, which is very quiet, heartfelt. It's got the vibes and the theremin and some of these kind of new instruments sort of coming in, and then we'll end with the aforementioned Probably Built in the 50s, which ends with this very crushing, cool Neurosis, Isis kind of riff. So enjoy.
Clear and clear.
That was Probably Built in the 50s and Marooned from How to Measure a Planet. And then we opened with Third Chance and On Most Surfaces from Nighttime Birds from 1997. So we talk a lot when Chris is around, which is a good thing. So we have to kind of make our quick goodbyes. But luckily, we already talked about the song that we're going to end things with tonight, which is the Liberty Bell tune, which really is this sort of full embrace of positivity, as Chris was kind of mentioning, a much more upbeat sort of attitude that they have. And like I said, a good kind of omen of things to come, I think, from If Then Else and Souvenirs and some of the stuff that's going to be kind of happening down the road. So stick around for the journey. Part 2 will be coming up in a couple weeks, I'm sure, from when you hear this episode. And it's hard for us to know when this episode's actually going to post, because like I said, we're recording this in April of 2018.
Pretty far ahead right now.
Yeah, we're pretty far ahead, and we've got some things banked up. So, but we do encourage you to follow us on Twitter, Mark and Jason, or I'm sorry, that's Facebook, Mark and Jason, or on Twitter, which is at Podcast Requiem. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out our website, www.requiemmetal.com, which you can get some cool merch. You can get t-shirts and different things like that. You can check out some of Mark's artwork if you want to engage in buying that.
You can hire me if you want.
You can hire him. Yeah, you should, indeed.
I just bought a house, so I need the money.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, at this point, you'll be fully moved in by the time this episode sort of hits.
And if you support his house and him getting into this house, it means he has a bigger workspace to do cooler things.
Cooler things, indeed. And we'll hopefully both Mark and I will, at our 2 houses, will have kind of a studio space here in the future, because I'm actually looking to do some work on my house and maybe hopefully finish my basement. So we'll have a Requiem studio maybe down there as well. And speaking of that, the other thing you could do, besides leaving us a comment and positive star rating on iTunes, is you can follow us on Patreon. And you can get to the Patreon link through the aforementioned website, or you can just visit Patreon /Requiem Podcast and find us there. And the Patreon money and the donations that you guys have done, that's what allowed us actually to fly here to do this podcast with Chris, and to be able to go to the Requiem, or not the Requiem, the Decibel Beer and Metal Festival.
Slow down.
Yeah. We're not sponsoring
someday.
We are not sponsoring any music festivals at this point. But so again, we really do appreciate all the Patreon support, and in fact, Patreon
it helps us do this.
Yeah, it helps us do this. And one of the things, but at this point, that you guys know, if you are a Patreon supporter, is you're going to get early access to episodes, special episodes. You've already heard the Allman Brothers and the Peter Green Fleetwood Mac episodes, and maybe you'll even receive some of this gathering stuff. Who knows? Depends on what kind of crazy mood Mark is in for editing purposes. Kind of a pain in the butt. One thing I actually want to talk to you about sometime is seeing if maybe through Patreon money, once we sort of get in the flow of things, if we could hire almost like somebody that would do some of the editing for us a little bit.
I just need better equipment.
Okay.
That's what it comes down to.
But I'm sure there might be somebody out there that would be interested.
Possibly, but I don't trust anybody else.
Don't trust anybody?
Yeah, that's the problem.
So, well, who knows? It was just it was an idea.
If we could get, maybe an intern.
Almost like an intern.
That would do
like
exactly what I told them to do, but it's almost more work than just doing it myself.
Float them a little bit of money or something like that.
Maybe when I'm 60.
Yeah, there you go. But Chris, I think you're going to stick around for some more episodes, so we don't have to say our goodbyes, but we do appreciate you helping us out with part 1 here.
We'll say pause for now.
Yeah, so, but...
It's been a pleasure, Jason.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure, Mark.
Awesome. I'm glad
see you guys.
Always glad to have you.
2.
Yeah, see you on the flip side. But So for Requiem Metal Podcast, we've got Liberty Bell from How to Measure a Planet. I am Jason.
I'm Mark.
I'm Chris.
Goodbye.